if you judge everyone by the same yardstick, then of course there will be some things that disabled people are not able to do, but also some things that those people are better at. People spend a lot of time focusing on what disabled people can't do rather than what they can do.
Hey Hugh, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to have you on here, honestly, really excited.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Let's do our intros. Please tell everybody who you are, what you do, and, what you're about.
Yeah, absolutely. I have done this so many times as kind of an exercise. Sum up their identity in a few different words. But the first thing that probably stands out to people is I grew up in Australia. The accent's a giveaway. So I grew up in West Australia. I moved to London about 6 years ago. I have worked in a lot of different spaces, like a lot of different sectors. More recently, very much in kind of the LGBT plus community and disability community space. They're parts of my lived experience as well. So I love being able to do that.
And so we met at Uber, right? And we were both working in the ERGs. I was in the Black at Uber ERG. You were in, what was it called? The Pride then? I'm sure it's probably got a different name now.
I think it's called Uber Pride. I don't know if it still is, but yeah.
Yeah. And obviously when you're working in an ERG, you're working in this, community group alongside your day job as well. But a lot of people are doing it out of passion. But I always felt like you were a very safe person to speak to. Some people you can just speak to and be completely honest, and be your complete self, or talk about things that are quite difficult that other people, there's a lot of fragility there. And I just wondered if that was something that you had noticed or other people had said this to you. And if you'd noticed that this is one of your, unique qualities and strengths.
Yeah, I mean, that's really flattering, firstly. I would say, I think that's a quality that I think I'm very proud of. And it's really nice to hear that from others. That also lends itself to what I do now, which I didn't really go into. So now I work in the diversity and inclusion space. And I work with quite a small organization that's like a members-based charity. So we have lots of other organizations that we support through that work. So that's an important kind of characteristic, I guess, for what I do. I've definitely heard that before when I worked for the Mosaic Trust. Some of the young persons described me as the Australian Ned Flanders because of my, I love that, because of my, enthusiasm in talking about a lot of these things. And I had some comments from people saying, when you first joined, I really thought it was disingenuous. I thought it was a little bit of a performance, your kind of attitude and enthusiasm to these topics. But then they said that they felt that was genuine. And again, that makes me really happy because it is a really important part of what I do, and I generally can't shut up about it. This whole conversation of diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, this is the thing, right? So you're great at creating safe spaces for people who share your identities and people who don't share your identities. And I really want to know how you went from big tech like Uber into charity work and into supporting people specifically with different identities.
Yeah, definitely. I think it relates to that kind of conversation about fragility. I don't really shy away from speaking about things that sometimes are quite difficult. And actually, I think it's because of a huge amount of my own privilege. I really was brought up such that I was often in spaces that were safe for me. In Perth, I went to quite a privileged private school. I would often have conversations with my parents, both my parents at dinner, which were really open. And so I knew what that was for me to benefit from that. And I think I see what value that adds for individuals because of how I had those things. In terms of the shift, it was kind of selfish. I loved volunteering at Mosaic and attending the youth club sessions. And I found that after being there for an evening, that my cup was full, that I was surrounded by people who were passionate about what they were doing. And I saw that we were having a really genuine impact on young people's lives. And it was the feeling that gave me and how positive that was. So yeah, I say it was kind of selfish because I got so much out of being able to have that kind of interaction with people. And I also did it because I was looking for a community when I moved to the UK as well. So I wanted to find people who had shared experiences and just kind of got hooked, I guess.
Just in case anybody missed it, I want to just be very clear what Mosaic is. Can you explain to us what Mosaic is?
Yeah, of course. So full name, Mosaic LGBT plus Young Persons Trust. They are a LGBT plus youth centre that supports, young people from all across London. So it's really a social space. They run networks and sessions, but it's really an opportunity for those young persons to meet people like them as they're asking questions about their sexuality and gender, and to maybe access support. They speak to mentors and do summer camps and lots of things. It's meant to be, it is a very like fun space and a very uplifting space.
It's community based, right?
Yeah.
I love that. I want to stick on identity for a bit because for me, this is an area that I am so interested in, but I also don't know the answers. And I think that's great. Like for me personally, this type of work is always about continuously learning. And even when I feel like we've got the answers, sometimes I think they also evolve as we evolve as human beings. And so I want to talk about identity, right? So we have all these labels, right? You've got BAME, which is barely used anymore. Now you've got people of color, which I honestly, I loathe that category or name. For me, it's weird. Then we've got LGBTQ plus, and we've got other labels, disabled, non-disabled, etc., etc. I wanted to know how much value you think that these labels have for us as people. Does it do the work of being divisive, or is it necessary for us right now to have those labels whilst we're still building equity and inclusion for each other? And is there a point when we can kind of get rid of them and just accept that we're all unique beings?
I think it's
Sorry, so that's a loaded question.
a bit of a $1 million question as well.
It is, yeah.
I get asked this a lot. And one thing, I guess, the first sort of distinction to draw out, my old manager used to say that label is not really a term that he liked, because label is something that's done to us rather than an identity term which we're able to apply to ourselves to, again, find people like us. So in the way that I was looking for community when I moved here, if I looked up volunteering opportunities, might have found it. But if I looked up LGBT plus volunteering opportunities, I'm closer to finding something that is similar to my experience. The challenge with these terms, right, is that two things. One, they're often definitions by exclusion. So terms like BAME and POC or people of color are often looking for ways of saying everyone who's not white, which is really weird to identify the vast majority of the world's population by not being something. And it also means that their identity is always defined in proximity to whiteness, which is so strange and hugely problematic. You get similar things in other spaces, right? LGBT plus, and many people kind of add letters to this, but what you're often talking about is people who don't identify with the gender that was recorded on their birth certificate, and who are not heterosexual. So there's clunkiness often in these terms as they are, but I think having a term generally can serve a positive purpose depending on who has the power to kind of use it and where they're doing that. The other example I delivered a session the other day, and if I want to watch a movie like on Netflix, I put in LGBT, then I might find something that again relates to my experience. So it's useful in collecting stories along particular themes, as long as it's not limiting.
That's so interesting, because I do the same. Sometimes I do the same, but I don't know I'm doing it. You know, when I'm looking for a film and I'm wanting to find Black actors, because sometimes, look, I can watch films with any different types of protagonists, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes I'm specifically looking for things that I can just relate to very easy. And I don't know why. I just am. But I don't necessarily go looking for Black stories, even though there's not often a category like Black. I can't remember what it's called on Netflix, but sometimes I just go looking for Black actors' names. I just search in the names to find them in the stories, because they add for me a different dynamic. So it can, I find it can be useful. But I also find that what we're doing is that we are grouping a whole bunch of people together. So identity for me is these labels of identity is very complicated. And also in some ways I find it limiting because what we're doing is grouping people together, right? Based on what we deem as something they don't have, like you said. And psychologically, I find that a very difficult thing as a Black woman to accept, because you're constantly asking me to accept that I am less and that you want me to consistently identify that for you so you understand. So in some ways, I'm like, this is detrimental to me. But in other ways, like you said, in order to find the things that I want or that I like or that can help me connect, it can be useful. So I feel like it's figuring out when it's valuable for us and like when it isn't. And which I think moves me nicely on to my next question around celebrating cultural moments, right? This is something I think I've seen in the last few years become a lot more, people have become a lot more vocal about it. It happened when we were working, right? Is that companies would spend a lot of time and a lot of effort in Pride Month or in a particular day, or even now, I don't see any companies putting a lot of effort in Black History Month anymore. They used to probably do a few things here and there, but I think a lot of the time that people are not doing it because Black people are tired. And I'm not going to be surprised if in a few years the LGBTQ community are going to be tired as well of constantly having to push something just for 1 month, when actually when people are asking for a persistent presence and inclusion. As someone who works in that space within this community, how would you suggest companies to really include different identities and celebrate the differences without focusing on Pride Month or Black History Month? What are the tools that you would use, and what would you recommend?
Yeah, again, it's such $1 million question and such a big conversation. I think that organizations can do meaningful work in this space. I'm enormously cynical, but they can. And I think that often it starts with the question of, why are you doing this? So if you put on a Black History Month event before asking your Black employees if they feel safe in the workplace all the time, you're not doing it for them, you're doing it for you. If you ask your LGBT plus employees before Pride Month to speak about potentially difficult, traumatic experiences in their life for a podcast so that other people can understand their experience, who is that for? Is it for them, or is it for other people in the organization? The other really really example of this, I've been to so many International Women's Days events that are planned and organized by women in the organization outside of their day jobs to do extra work. They're attended only by women, and they're a panel of often otherwise not intersectional women talking about their experiences in an organization with no men present. So the people in the room know what challenge the women in the organization face. They're not the ones who need to be told what insights the panelists have. It's the men in the organization who aren't present. So I think there's a lot to consider in terms of how people commemorate these days, but it kind of leads me on to the other point, which is just, if you really do want to support those people, ask them what they need. Don't make assumptions. Ask open questions about what would it take for you to feel safe and supported in the workplace. What do you need to thrive here and to feel like you can really meaningfully contribute to your role? And then when they tell you, listen and act on it, it really is that simple. People will often know, sometimes they don't. And that's a case a lot with potentially some disabled people where they're still kind of forming their identity around their disability, if a diagnosis is recent or an acquired disability, things like that. But in many other cases, people will often know what kind of support that they need. So you just need to ask and then do as they've said.
I mean, it's actually quite straightforward.
Yeah. Really good. Yeah.
That's what's making me laugh so much, is because of all these conversations I have and I ask people to solve big problems, right? And the solution is always very simple. And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, but why are we still not doing that? And I think what you said was so incredible, because actually what I found is a lot of the time is leadership, which I think can be very quite male heavy.
Yeah, for sure.
Leadership often demand data. They're like, okay, I want data, I want numbers, etc. And I think that they undervalue qualitative data, right? Is that by asking the people who you're trying to serve what it is that they need, that is also incredibly valuable data. It can be more valuable than going to look at numbers. Actually, do you know what? The best thing to do is try and put them together and try and understand what's actually happening.
Yeah.
I think that's a really excellent tip for people who are trying to be inclusive, to celebrate the diversity and all of the differences that they have within an organization, a city, or whatever. But do it in the most authentic way, is to ask people and then to listen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, there's sometimes conversations about like, then you're putting the labor on like global majority to fix the problem of racism, because you're asking them again to tell you what it is that they need to like fix the problem. The other thing is like Google is free. It doesn't necessarily mean like asking uncomfortable questions of your colleagues about their experience, and asking really like probing questions that can often be uncomfortable. If the relationship is there and that person's comfortable speaking, like brilliant, but don't necessarily expect that everyone wants to be an advocate for the whole of their community. And if they're not, that person in your workplace, then there's a lot of information out there on the internet, where people have podcasts, TV shows, books. These are all great resources to also learn about those communities.
Honestly, I'm laughing again because this is true. It's like there's so much resource available out there for us to understand different experiences, different lives. We are in the age of information. So if you don't have anybody to go to, there's more than enough information out there in books, in podcasts, in films, etc. It's really about, I think, being open-minded, removing fragility out of the way, and being able to see what's really in front of you. I think those are great skills and great tip on being able to just go to Google, or if you use ChatGPT, go to ChatGPT if that's your preferred now, but you can ask the question somewhere and get some form of answer.
Yeah.
You spoke about advocacy and advocating, and obviously I know personally that you do a lot of advocacy for disability and LGBTQ communities. And I want to talk about disability because this is something that comes up often for me in the work that I do when I do work for clients on inclusive marketing, is that they focus a lot on race and ethnicity, gender, age, and very much different identities within the LGBTQ community, right? And those are the core things that they focus on. And I'll be honest with you, disability is something we and other people in my team always try to push as well, because it's crucial. It's absolutely crucial. This is a key part of the whole puzzle. But actually, a lot of companies, either they're not comfortable with it, or it's something that they don't feel quite ready to tackle. And I really want to talk to you about this, because this is the work that you're already doing. And I want to understand a little bit more how we can help organizations be truly inclusive and be able to include disability into their frameworks that they're creating in order to be more equitable in their environments.
Yeah. I mean, again, like, thank you for giving space to that question, because I find often that the biggest issue is that it's just not there. It's not necessarily that people are like resistant to talking about it when the question comes up. They just like forget or don't think about it entirely. I definitely talk about this a lot as well. So as well as the Mosaic Trust, I was also the chair of the Muscle Health Foundation, which is again a small charity that delivers empowering muscle dream experiences for young people with with muscular dystrophy, which is a family of muscle wasting conditions. And I got involved with them because I have a type of muscular dystrophy. my disability is very non-visible. And I think that's important context when I talk about what my experience of disability is like. In a way, it's a privilege because I can choose who I share that with. But in a way, it creates additional barriers because often when I tell people, I'm not believed. So there's kind of like some interesting pros and cons, I guess, to that as well. I can't talk about disability in relation to other characteristics other than, I guess, LGBT and my specific experience as a gay man. But I personally find, at least against the topic of sexuality and for gay men, people very comfortable with that. But disability, very awkward. I often find that people are a little bit embarrassed and they don't know what to say, so they say nothing. I was diagnosed with my condition in 2007, and I love when I catch up with old friends and they remember and they ask me and they say, "How are you doing now?" Because my condition is progressive, so it affects me more and more all the time, and eventually I will need to use a wheelchair and other mobility aids. So I see this in my own interaction with other people. There's a resistance for fear of getting it wrong and saying the wrong thing and saying something offensive. That happens a lot in the DEI space more generally, but I see it a lot with disability. I think it comes back to the point about fragility. If you just accept the fact that you will make mistakes when talking about any of these things, you're then free to meaningfully engage without the fear of upsetting someone. Just accept that you will. Don't do it on purpose, obviously, but just say, "I'm going to get it wrong." You can then engage in a way that works for you. And I think this applies for individuals and workplaces as well. Just having the conversation. There's no one size fits all approach to any of these things. That again is my issue with the collective identity terms. Disability is a huge umbrella of experiences. Even within the muscular dystrophy family, those experiences are really different across the conditions. So it's really hard to say, you know one person, you know everyone, you know what they'll need. It's again asking, listening, and then doing what those people need. But yeah, don't be afraid to get it wrong. I'd rather that you said something that was not really well constructed, that I talk about my disability and you change the subject. That for me would be worse.
Yeah, and I guess with disability, I can only compare it to the Black experience, right? In the way that I'm going to explain it is that it's not the same for everybody, right? So some people may want you to ask them questions.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well, not. And it's going to be your job to find that out. And I think that's something that we all have to be comfortable with. Like you said, look, we've got to be comfortable with making mistakes. That's something that I had to reconcile with, is that I can make mistakes. I can make mistakes about my own community. Because I tell you something, I used to put the fear of God in me, Black Twitter, because I thought I never in my lifetime ever want to upset Black Twitter. And don't ever think that if you're Black, you can't upset Black Twitter, because we all know that that is not true. So it can happen within your own community. You can get things wrong.
Yeah.
It is key. It is key that as an individual, as a family, as a community, as a workplace, as a leader, that then you may make mistakes. And I think going in with that, having that in your mind, with that mindset, protects you and also the other person in some way, because you approach things in a different way with some vulnerability. And the vulnerability is key, because then the person can at least help you, help you to understand and help you to be a better ally, or just better understand their experience. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about inclusion that we can have in the workplace, specifically for people that have different disabilities. And because the fact is, when I looked at the numbers, right, is that a good way to measure whether a country or a region is inclusive and offers a good standard of life for people who live with a disability is how well they're integrated into work. How many people who have a disability are able to work. And if you look at some of the countries, you know, if I just, for example, Italy versus Poland, Poland versus the UK, is that the numbers are wildly different. Now, obviously, with the data itself, it's not all clean data because every country measures different things as disabilities. They're not all specifically one thing into a category, right? There's different things that come into the category of disability. But obviously, in order to make sure that we're truly being inclusive to everybody, right? The amount of disabled people going into work is crucial. And it's something that was spoken about a lot during COVID, because that was the first time, I remember seeing it all over Twitter. That was the first time that I really heard voices of disabled people talking about how the difference in what the world was able to tolerate in working in a completely different way, working remotely, allowing people to still do their work, but they wouldn't allow this for people who asked for this so that they could also be a working member of society if they had a disability. They weren't given that flexibility and that understanding. So it's a long-winded way of asking you, how can we do the basics of integration if you know what those things are?
Yeah, it is a really interesting point. There's actually like some legislation around this in the UK that people don't often realize. Like, as again, for context, don't forget, I didn't grow up here. I've been here for 6 years. So just because it's a surprise to me doesn't necessarily mean that it would have been a surprise for others. But I was interested that I only really started learning about this when I joined my current workplace. The idea of the duty of care to provide reasonable adjustments. It's a legal requirement for employers in the UK to provide reasonable adjustments to disabled people who they do know or could be reasonably expected to know are disabled. So in a way, that's probably more protection than people might expect. I think the problem is that a lot of people don't realize that it's there, including disabled people don't necessarily realize that their employer has that responsibility. So what this means effectively is if a manager or an employer was to notice that someone had like prolonged periods of absence or finding particular tasks difficult, the conversation in a performance review might be broadly about, is there any kind of support that you need to do your job? You don't necessarily need to ask the like very direct head-on question, do you have a disability? Again, a lot of people might not know. It might be something that they're going in the process of like getting diagnosis for, like whatever that person's journey is. But the responsibility should be on those people to say, what support do you need? And again, it's just having that conversation. I think it's going to be more likely that people feel it's too difficult, it's a bit uncomfortable. They make assumptions that that person is like lazy, not fit for the job. They become frustrated, they leave, and then that person perhaps like doesn't then become employed again. And they, you know, like their circumstances completely change as a result of that. I think there are a lot of opportunities between that person starting the job or acquiring a disability within the job and them being failed to the point of needing to leave. And the easiest way to stop that is at any point someone just saying, are you okay? Is there anything you need to be able to do your job? Again, pretty simple. Like, spoke about my disability when I applied for my job now. And our CEO is a blind woman with ADHD, has excellent, of course, lived experience of this and understands deeply what other disabled people need. So I was offered lots of things in a conversation about reasonable adjustments and have a lot of understanding about how I might be able to travel or carry heavy things or even a laptop around. So just that question of what do you need? Is there anything that's potentially a bit of a challenge for you that we might be able to support you with? Again, it's pretty simple, but people just don't even think to have that conversation.
I'm going to wrap this up soon, but I just wanted to talk to you about the interview that I just had with a couple called Peter and Mira and the leadership exec coaches. And we were talking about performance reviews and how they're a bit stale, right? And how they're really focused on like these KPIs, numbers, anything to do with revenue, right? And that's what our individual performance reviews, a lot of companies are really focused on that, especially in tech. And I think that there is some connection between having these really like aggressive targets and also that being surrounding a culture of working. They spoke about how leaders are actually burned out at this moment, right? And also working on tasks that are not going to go anywhere, back-to-back meetings.
Yeah.
And then I also think that what's happening is that we're measuring all people. And I think I could be wrong here. So I might make a mistake. So you could correct me if you know the answer. Is that we're measuring disabled people based on non-disabled people's performances. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So adjusting performance. We're not adjusting performance to each individual and giving them a target, right, that fits them and what they're capable of and what they also bring to the organization. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. And like, I mean, that would be an example of indirect discrimination. If you have a policy that applies to everyone but negatively affects some people, then you have it's like if you have a dress code in a school that mandates particular hairstyles, but people with like black hair who want to wear their hair naturally will be excluded because of the policy applying to everyone but negatively impacting them specifically. If you judge everyone by the same yardstick, then of course there will be some things that disabled people are not able to do, but also some things that those people are better at. People spend a lot of time focusing on what disabled people can't do rather than what they can do. And they also spend a lot of time focusing on that person's condition or impairment that means they're disabled and not the barriers that actually are the things that disable them. It's the whole idea of the social model of disability. You know, at my organization, our CEO talks about her challenge in being blind is not the literal thing of not being able to see. It's not being able to navigate the world. Or, you know, for my brother is a wheelchair user. What is difficult for him is not necessarily the weakness of his muscles, is that he can't go into certain places because of his wheelchair. So it's about understanding the perspective of what's the real cause of this person's quote unquote disadvantage. And when we recognize that we as individuals and as a society have actually a lot more control over it, it's not about guilt or shame. It's actually empowering to say there's actually something that can be done here. And that's really positive.
Yeah, I think, like you said, I think there's a lot of indirect discrimination happening, is that we're judging disabled people, non-disabled people, everybody the same, and not looking at everybody's individuals' qualities and being able and really saying, okay, this is where you shine. I want to see you shine on this. And this is what you contribute. Let's wrap up because I want to ask you just probably one more $1 million question. Is that I want one more, Hugh, for you. I want to know how we can move from identities being in this kind of like marginalized space where we build communities, etc., or where they are not part of the mainstream, how we take marginalized communities into normalized, you know, as part of a normal part of everyday society.
I think it's about the frequency and the way in which we have conversations about who is marginalized and why. I think that the more that we have these kind of conversations about barriers that are presented to certain people and support that a person needs, it doesn't feel like a slog. It doesn't feel like this person is needy, above and beyond, really extra, they're really particular and specific. It's just, great, we just need to get that person the things that they need to be able to do their job. And it actually underpins all kind of work around culture and diversity and inclusion. It applies for people with children, people with caring responsibilities, older people and younger people, disabled people, neurodiverse people, like literally everyone is included in that. If you just talk about specific things that individual people need and feel comfortable asking everyone, I think I like the idea that these terms will always be there a little bit as a way for us to identify people who maybe are a bit like us, but they shouldn't feel like dirty words. And it shouldn't feel like to use euphemisms. If a person is a wheelchair user and you're telling a story and it's an essential part of the story, it's not bad for you to say that. You know what I mean? You shouldn't feel uncomfortable. It's just a descriptor that may be relevant for that story. If it's not relevant and you used it, then that's maybe a different conversation.
You, honestly, I feel quite emotional actually after what you just said. I really do. It gives me such hope for the future. It really does. Thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom and for sharing your experience, both your lived experience and your professional experience, and giving that information to the rest of the world.
A pleasure. No, thank you so much. And I perhaps sometimes talk too much, but I love, having these conversations with people who care about these things too. And thank you so much for having me.